Hello, my name is Ellen Mintz, and I'm a professional development facilitator with Activate Learning. Today we are going to examine discourse strategies for the elementary classroom. These are the topics that we're going to address. While we recognize that there are differences in the types and depth of responses we can expect from students in primary grades and students in upper elementary grades, we'd like to share information and common strategies that can be used to promote student growth at all grade levels. The outcomes we'd like to see are the same, regardless of grade level or student ability. As we go through this presentation, all samples will come directly from the Activate Learning Prime curriculum. I'd like you to take some time to think about the challenges that you face getting students to participate in productive and focused discussions, and why it's important to try and create a culture in the classroom to overcome these challenges. There may be significant differences in the discourse challenges faced by K-2 teachers and 3-5 teachers, but again, those outcomes that we want are still the same. Here are some common responses we hear from teachers when discussing this topic. In the K-2 classroom, we have rarely stifled student thinking and participation. Everyone wants to be heard and share their ideas, regardless of how off-topic they might be. As soon as a student's hand goes in the air, we can assume that listening has ceased, and the only thing that's important to the student is that they're called on. The same idea can be repeated over and over and over again by multiple students, but no one notices because no one hears or listens to what anyone else has to say. By the time students get to 3rd grade, they become more interested in the right answer. This is one of the factors that contributes to the difficulty teachers experience when teaching science. Voicing an idea based on prior knowledge, experience, or just plain speculation is extremely important in getting students to take risks and contribute to classroom discussions. Students are often afraid of being wrong. Many students are more interested in the grade than the process. The idea that they could be multiple correct answers or ideas is completely foreign to most elementary students. And again, no one listens to anybody else because classroom culture has continued to focus on the teacher as the deliverer of information rather than students constructing understanding individually and in groups. Yet research has repeatedly shown that classroom discourse helps students make sense of their own learning. When students share, it helps other students process their own thinking when their ideas conform to the thinking of their peers, or when they're made aware of key points articulated by others. Higher level thinking is also enhanced when students have the opportunity to challenge the ideas of others and explain their own ideas during classroom discussions. However, for meaningful talk to take place in the classroom, we must do more than just establish time for talk. We need to teach the skills needed to engage students in productive discussions. First, we will focus on ways students communicate in the classroom. What kind of configurations are commonly used? What are the pros and cons of each? Anyone who walks into an elementary science classroom during an active investigation could not help but notice the amount of talking taking place. What tends to happen, though, is as soon as the discussion begins, it is the teacher's voice that emerges as the most dominant in the room. Exciting conversations disappear, and the talk changes to teacher-led discussions with very little student interaction. The challenge we face is to encourage accountable science discourse without sacrificing any of the enthusiasm or the fluency of student talk. Let's take a look at the traditional classroom. The teacher is at the center of the discussion. How does this type of configuration contribute to the challenges we've listed? Perhaps this information may be a little more relevant for 3-5 teachers, but we'll get to those common characteristics. Your students may sit in rows, they may sit side by side or in groups, but the discussions often have the same routines and are for the same purpose. Typically in the 3-5 classroom, students raise their hand when they think they have the right answer. They respond to teacher-posed questions, which is designed to have a particular answer confirmed. Very little time is spent where students respond to peers' ideas. Teachers ask the questions, students answer. The teacher validates a student response, or additional information is sought from another student. It goes back and forth between the teacher and student, sort of like a ping pong game, until the correct answer is established. If we're really lucky, a student will ask a question during a discussion if they're confused about a concept. Students who are really good at reciting correct answers in science are often labeled advanced or gifted and really are motivated by looking and acting smart. The class depends on those few know-it-all kids to move the discussion and activities forward, while others don't talk, they don't participate, and frankly, they don't really care. Sometimes we deliver information, sometimes we discuss worksheets after students read or participate in a lab experience. We discuss to confirm something they already have learned. We're good at asking questions and ensuring all students have the opportunity to hear that right answer. The idea of improving discourse strategies has become complicated due to the necessity for virtual learning in hybrid classrooms. Fortunately, many of the meeting platforms that are being used in classrooms now provide ways for students to interact in small groups. We need to move forward towards more of this type of configuration. Note that the teacher remains a part of the discussion, but is not the driving force in the conversation. In order to accomplish this, a classroom culture that enhances the way students communicate in our classroom must be established. We need to explicitly create opportunities for engagement in science learning through discussions that are situated within the context of the active investigation. Our goal is to have students asking questions of each other by developing their capacity as thinkers and problem solvers. This way, they become participants in thoughtful talk about core content and develop their scientific reasoning skills while constructing theories and explanation. But this can only be accomplished by modeling sharing, listening, and learning with the goal of demonstrating the value of contributing to a discussion. There are various configurations that can be used to promote discourse in the classroom. Whole group discussions are still very important. They are often used to establish the purpose of a lesson and spark student interest. Very often, teachers probe student knowledge about a topic and allow them to make personal connections. At the end of a lesson, the goal might be for students to articulate their own understanding. We need to teach strategies for students to discuss and respond to each other to change the way students participate. Small group discussions occur with or without the teacher and are an integral part of the learning process. Students are provided with the opportunity to learn and interact with each other by sharing their thinking and building on each other's ideas during an investigation or as a means of debriefing afterwards. Students need the skills to ensure that all students participate, express their ideas, listen to each other, and respect each other's ideas. Having a meaningful discussion in a small group is not the norm in most elementary school classrooms. It must be taught to change the way students participate. And those same needs occur when students are asked to work in pairs. That same explicit instruction needs to be provided to change the way students communicate with each other. There are several types of discussions that take place in a science classroom, and their purposes differ. We're going to examine the purposes of the discussions, show examples of the types of questions asked during that type of discussion, and share some prompts that may be used to foster different types. All of the examples used come directly from the Activate Learning Prime curriculum. The first type is an introductory or brainstorming discussion. Usually the purpose is to generate ideas without any evaluation attached. This encourages students to share ideas without worrying about whether their answers are right or wrong. There is limited challenge or disagreement during an introductory discussion because all contributions are valid and valued. Questions are often open-ended, allowing students to make connections to their own world. Another purpose for an introductory discussion is to make connections to prior lessons, other units, and content from other grade levels. This allows teachers to determine what connections students are making to prior learning. It is important that the opening question in an introductory or brainstorming discussion provides a clear focus. Interest in the lesson is sparked as the emphasis is given for the day's investigation. Often ideas are recorded on chart paper so students can see what has been said and build on each other's ideas. Students should be encouraged to generate their own questions based on hunches and wonderings about the topic introduced. Follow-up questions are a part of these discussions, and student-to-student discourse should be encouraged. Here's an example from a first grade unit. In this lesson, students are asked to observe sounds in their environment and record detailed and accurate description of those sounds. Follow with me while I read this question. Ask the children what words make them think of sound. Examples include terms such as music, noise, instruments, loud, soft, pretty, screechy, banging, singing, yelling, and buzzing. Their ideas will probably include both sources and descriptors, so ask children to help you add the terms to the appropriate column on a chart. Note that students are encouraged to brainstorm without any need for judgment or right or wrong responses. All answers are accepted, recorded, and provisions are even made for ideas that might not fit the actual question. This provides an opportunity for teachers to observe students' ability to describe sound. This third grade example sets the stage for an exploration of weather tools and their purpose. Read along with me again. Divide students into small groups. Ask the children to think back to the weather pictures they saw and described in the What is Weather lesson. Also, remind them of the class definition of weather, as well as the role that wind, water, clouds, sunlight, and temperature plays in weather. Now in their groups, ask the students to imagine ways they might collect temperature, wind, cloud cover, and precipitation data. After giving them a few minutes to think of ideas, invite them to share their ideas with the class. Note that in this introductory discussion, there's a bit more complexity. Students are asked to recall information from a prior investigation, and the prompt focuses students on the fact that an understanding of their prior learning about weather is going to be applied in this investigation. Students are asked to envision ways to measure certain aspects of the weather. Introductory discussions can also be accomplished in small groups. This example clearly relates what students are going to brainstorm to prior lessons and real-life experiences. Students will be required to share out information as a group, which requires them to come to consensus and listen to each other before sharing. Again, those strategies must be explicitly shared with students in order to accomplish this. Our final example of a brainstorming discussion comes from a fifth grade unit. In this lesson, students will be predicting, observing, and describing what happens to a drop of rain after it falls on different surfaces. Read along with me. Ask students what they think happens to a drop of rain after it falls, without having a preliminary group discussion, which might influence or limit individual theories. Give the students some time to think about and explain their raindrop scenario on the raindrop initial thoughts section in their online or print notebooks. Walk around the room to quickly assess how students respond to the question you posed, and if necessary, find ways to extend their thinking and add detail to their explanations. For example, these questions might provoke in-depth answers. What have they seen raindrops do? What happens to the raindrop in the first few minutes after it falls? How can a drawing show the movement of a raindrop? Suggest if applicable that adding arrows, captions, or labels might make ideas clearer. Students are asked to record their thinking in their science notebooks before sharing out loud. This rehearsal time is very important for many students as it gives them time to gather and organize their thoughts before sharing out loud. Access to what they have recorded also provides a place for students to add information as they recognize data they may have omitted from their own entry. This example also points out the teacher's role during introductory discussions, as well as prompts that can be used to help students extend their thinking and avoid overly simple explanations while not leading the students to a particular conclusion. Here are some prompts that can be used during an introductory or brainstorming discussion. Remember, the purpose is to encourage the sharing of ideas without judgment or evaluation. The focus and purpose of the discussion should be established through an opening question. All ideas should be accepted. Students should be accountable for listening to the experiences and ideas of other students using techniques that require them to restate and elaborate on other students' ideas. Students' ideas should be captured and recorded to be used as a future reference. The next type of discussion is a sharing discussion. The goal here is to have ideas shared using specific examples from data collected during an investigation without the focus immediately being on right and wrong answers. Students are to look for patterns and begin to analyze their data to make meaning. Typically, student notebook entries are used to help students make connections between what they did and how this supports answers to the questions that are posed. Academic language should be encouraged when students share results from their data. Dialogue should ensue to help students with their reasoning and for clarity. While it is the teacher who begins the discussion, it is important to try and have the students drive the conversation. Explicit strategies need to be taught to get students to the point where they are the ones who are controlling that conversation. Willing students can be given the task of leading discussions, and this will allow the teacher to step into the role of facilitator. So let's look at some examples. This first one is from a kindergarten unit, and the goal of this lesson is for students to understand that an animal is a living thing that can move on its own. Animals need food, water, air, and a place to live. And students have made drawings of individual animals in their habitats after reading informational text that features an animal of their choice. Let's read the prompt. Have the children bring their drawings to the sharing session. Invite them to share their drawings and to talk about why they chose their particular animal. While this might seem like an extremely simple activity, students are asked to point out during discussion the features in their picture that leads to an understanding of that big idea of the lesson. Students use their data, in this case it's a drawing, to describe the habitat features that support animal life. In this second grade unit, reversible and irreversible changes are the topic for this lesson. Students investigate and determine that some changes caused by heating and cooling are reversible and some are not. This is an example of how data from multiple students over multiple investigations is used to help students make meaning. Let's read together. Let children discuss the results of the investigations they did at home. Have them describe the effects of heating and cooling the different materials. As they share, tally the following on the board. How the properties of the lettuce changed after being cooled and heated. How the properties of their liquid changed after being cooled and heated. How do these effects compare to what they predicted would happen? Students describe what they observed to convey results. This data was gathered from the investigations done at home in a real-life setting. They connect this new data gathered at home to prior learning from the classroom. They support their ideas with data and determine if other students have come up with the same conclusions. Once again, student data is used to help make meaning. In this fourth grade sharing discussion, a design challenge was the focus of the lesson. Students were to brainstorm, develop, test, and share a communication solution that meets specific project criteria. Students also compare the results of their solutions to the problem as a way of constructing understanding of the concepts included in their designs. Invite partners to share their communication solutions with another group. Encourage them to offer helpful ideas about how to improve the way the communication solutions function. In particular, have them look for ways to make the coding strategy simple to use. Having multiple solutions reinforces the idea that there is often more than one way to convey specific core ideas. Responding to prompts in science notebooks allowed students to organize their thinking. Parameters were provided for this particular conversation taking place in groups. And this allows students to use what they have done to promote the learning of other students and their science content. So let's take a look at some additional prompts that can be used for sharing discussions. In the sharing discussions, ideas are based on the experiences of individual students. Instead of challenging ideas, teachers should encourage students to ask questions of other students about the information and ideas they share. Students are asked to share what they observed as a starting point for how they might think about a driving question. The focus now is on the results and the findings from an investigation. And students are beginning to analyze data and look for patterns, and very often come to significant conclusions that allow them to synthesize their learning, which is the focus of our final discussion type. Our final discussion is about reflection and synthesizing. Its purpose is to make sense of investigations, readings, or other responses to questions with the goal of getting below the surface by thinking deeply about the content. Student understanding of the concept being studied can often be assessed during these discussions. And as new information surfaces, students may actually revise their ideas because of what they have heard and what they have learned from each other. Those things often challenge their initial beliefs. Sharing may also take place as a part of these discussions. However, there are more deliberate outcomes expected when students reflect and synthesize. Teachers often take a much less active role in this process to ensure that they are not the ones solving the problem or delivering the correct answers. Questions should be posed to encourage connections between data that has been gathered and other student ideas. Teachers should listen for the use of academic language in these student responses. Reflective discussions can be used to review content and before continuing a topic in greater depth. It is important to note that when evaluating a student response during a reflective discussion, there is often more than just a got it or don't got it response. Rubrics and other assessment tools can be used to determine where students are on a learning continuum. So let's look at some example. There are several things to note from these discussion prompts used after investigation about the form and function of roots. Students are explicitly asked to summarize what they learned from a specific information here. Let's read together. Step 1. Use the children's experiences with roots to establish the two main jobs of a root. Roots that help support a plant and roots absorb water and nutrients from the soil. Use the following prompts. Where do people pour water when they're caring for growing plants? How does the water get from the soil to the plants? Do plants get anything else out of the soil? Note that in this step, students are encouraged to relate their responses to a very specific experience and are also asked to use the data they collected to come to conclusions. Let's look at step 2. Encourage children to think about how the structure of roots, their size, shape, and texture, help the roots do their job for the plant. Have children refer to their plant drawings. In this step, the question goes deeper, and students are once again asked to use their own data to make their responses more complete. Step 3. Return to the plants chart and ask children what they would like to add to the chart now that they have had a chance to observe roots more closely. This step requires students to summarize their learning and to add their content, in this case, form and function of roots, to their class chart. In this reflective discussion from the 3rd grade Forces in Action unit, students are processing data to conclude that a force has both strength and direction that determine how it affects the object's speed and/or direction of motion. They are asked to use their observations to explain the relationship that exists between the strength and direction of a force and how an object moves. Let's look at the first question. Discuss what the children observed about forces. Have the class look at the strength and direction tallies table of data from the exploration. Encourage them to find patterns in the effect of different forces. What do they notice about the strength of a force needed to start a car moving gradually or rapidly? What is needed to make a car go forward? What is needed to make a car turn? What direction of force is needed to stop a car once it's moving? The data that is gathered during their sharing discussion to create a class table is used to help students make sense of data and finding patterns. Specific questions are posed that are asked that require students to use data to come to specific conclusions. Because these questions are driving students to a specific scientific principle, there should be the same conclusion, although different experiences could lead students to their own individual responses. In part 2, challenge the class to explain the relationship between strength and direction of force and how an object moves in the following scenarios. What has to happen to get a car to start moving quickly in a certain direction? What has to happen to get a slow-moving car to stop? In this part of the discussion, students are asked to synthesize their learning and look for patterns as they apply the content in a new and different situation at a deeper level, explaining relationships between force and motion. And in our final example of a reflective and synthesizing discussion, we're going to examine a 5th grade lesson from the Ecosystems unit. Students have explored and obtained information to learn that decomposers and scavengers feed on dead organisms and waste. They move matter and carry out the process of decomposition. They have been exploring food chains and webs in ecosystems and are focusing on the scavengers and their role in those webs. So question 1 says, ask students what beetles get from dung or carrion. Remind them that all scavengers and decomposers feed on organic remains and waste, and in the process, the remains decompose, get broken into smaller pieces of matter. Here, students are responding using information they gathered and recorded in their science notebooks from informational texts. They're being asked to explain something, and in this case, the role of the beetle. Part 2 asked the class to visualize what their yard, playground, or park would look like if there weren't any scavengers. Note that students are now asked to think about the role of scavengers in a greater context and to think more deeply. And in part 3, follow up by questioning whether it would be completely clean if scavengers were there. Finally, students are asked again to think even deeper and consider a greater context as they consider other factors in their environment. So here are some general questions that can be used during reflective and synthesizing discussions. Remember, reflective synthesizing discussions develop conceptual understanding. They are often the most difficult for teachers and students. Analysis of data is done to create an explanation or theory. The focus is on what was learned, not what was done. Argument and debate are encouraged to help students draw conclusions. The goal is to arrive at the science idea or concept that is central to the investigation. So what are some ways that we can teach and promote productive discourse in our classroom? Let's talk about some just generic ideas. And we're going to start with ways that we want students to be seated. We want them to talk. We want that talk to be purposeful. We want students to feel comfortable and confident that they can participate without fear of ridicule or judgment. We want students to see the value of contributing, not just the right answers. And we also want students to know how to defend their ideas and challenging the ideas of others in a respectful way. When scientists discuss their findings, they're not seated in rows like classrooms are often set up when they're sharing their thinking. So how we situate students in the classroom helps set that tone for discourse. If we want students to listen to each other and contribute, we must show that the discussion is as important as the active investigation. Ensuring that all students can hear and see each other signals that this discussion is an integral part of that learning process. Questions need to be sequenced in a way that prevents us from immediately leading students to the correct answer. In the lessons used as examples, the questions encourage students to explain and describe before going for that final answer. They were trying to make connections. Adding on to responses using probing questions helps students go deeper and farther into concepts. Do not assume that students know when their answers aren't clear. Sentence starters and frames should be available for students as they learn structured talk and active listening. We'll look at some of those strategies that can help with this process. The goal is for you to stand back and listen to the students. Sentence starters and frames can help with this too. When students build on each other's ideas and observations, this again fosters active listening. Model and practice structured talk to teach discourse strategies. Sentence frames like these can be copied and given to students, or a poster can be made that displays them to the whole class. Primary students can be successful using these. If written language isn't appropriate for kindergarten students at the beginning of the year, reading the frames and pausing so students can fill in the blanks is appropriate. It is worth the effort to teach the frames and help students fill them in. Starting simple and offering only a few options allows students to master these frames one at a time. Practice, practice, practice. When students engage in conversations with their peers, they are forced to listen to what others are saying. Teachers can also prompt students by asking, who had the same idea? Who would like to add on? This is a more complex example of structured talk. Table tents can be made so that students can select the frames they need in discussions. As students become more comfortable using sentence frames, they will be able to choose the correct one for the purposes that they themselves have identified. To ensure students have the necessary information to participate in a structured discussion, data collection, summaries, pictures, diagrams, models, answers to question, or any type of entry can be used as the student's source of information from their science notebooks. Notebook entries take many forms and have varied levels of sophistication based on the age of the student, but all students can collect data in some manner. Student interactions with their notebooks is often when the science learning begins to happen. Patterns become evident, and students begin to analyze the evidence they need to debate and participate in the discussion. Students begin to make connections between what they have done and what they are to learn, and can prepare themselves for discourse when they are given this time for rehearsal. Sharing discussions provide the direct experience where students record in their notebooks. Creating notebooks entries is another skill to be taught, but that's another conversation for another time. Guidance needs to be provided when students use their notebooks. These entries serve as a direct link between the investigation and the explanation. Teachers need to have established a clear purpose for the discussion and have prompts ready to help students become proficient in sharing. This is where the sentence frames are used and those norms are implemented. You have to have a plan. The plan I'm going to share is based on the 5th grade Earth and Space unit. Students are learning what causes day and night. The student prompts ask for drawings to be made of what they think is the cause of daytime in the space below. They would also create another model for the cause of nighttime. Let's read this plan together. There is absolutely nothing left to chance here. Step 1, gather the students in a circle with their notebooks. The class configuration is addressed here. Students will sit in a circle facing each other. Step 2, promote the sharing of ideas about the question, what causes daytime and nighttime. Emphasize the following ways to express ideas during the discussion. Share ideas and questions, not answers. Think of and share your own ideas. Use your models to support your ideas. Talk on your own, respect others, and let everyone have a turn speaking. Use the appropriate sentence frame to acknowledge other ideas. They will have their notebooks with them as their source of information. The question has been established. It is restated. Students are reminded of the established norms. They are reminded of the necessity of using their notebook and using the sentence frames. Part 3, discuss briefly how the science talk went. Comment about the kinds of things you saw and heard that let you know someone was listening and thinking about the questions and statements of others. In step 3, it also shows the importance of evaluating a discussion. This part helps students think about the strategies they've been taught and how they are progressing in their own structured talk. Here is an activity from a 1st grade unit that can be easily adapted at any grade level. Students are looking for similarities and differences in different organisms between parents and their offspring. They have observed pictures of different organisms and are preparing to make a claim and to support that claim with evidence. A clear structure is provided. Explain to children that scientists want to be able to say something about the world that is true and be able to give examples that show what they say is true. They work to stand by a statement they think is true. To stand by something means that they think something is true. Scientists sometimes change their mind based on new things they learn and discover. Direct children to the statements you posted around the classroom. Animal offspring look exactly like their parents. They look completely different from their parents. They look similar to, but not exactly like their parents. Ask them to stand by the statement they think is true. Tell them there are no wrong answers and that it's okay for a scientist to change their mind. When they form these groups, they use the data they have collected in their science notebooks to present their finding. Students add on to each other's ideas, and if they determine they agree, they formulate a group statement to present to the entire class. When students are asked to listen to their peers, very often their own ideas are clarified, and they're able to make meaning based on what they hear from each other. Sometimes, however, their ideas change, but students can leave a group if they determine their ideas do not match those of the rest of that group. This activity accentuates the opportunity to rehearse before ideas are presented to the class. The discussion moves from small group to whole group. Interaction in groups is encouraged, and small groups must come to consensus before those ideas are presented. Any content statement from any unit at any grade level can be used in an activity like this to help students develop their ability to collaborate and to come to consensus. One of the goals in science instruction is for students to incorporate the challenging language of science in their discussions. The repeated use of new academic language is emphasized in both oral and written language. Programs such as Activate Learning Prime introduce words in the context of investigations so students build conceptual understanding and see how the word applies to their learning. It is important that new vocabulary is integrated into all discussions. Maintaining an interactive word wall in the classroom ensures that student exposure to new vocabulary is ongoing. Having student-created representations of words supports those who may struggle with written language and in making connections between words and their meanings. Using academic language during discussions becomes routine when students have the word wall as a reference. The portion of the word wall displayed here is from the 4th grade Transfer of Energy unit. It illustrates different forms of energy. And to facilitate an effective discussion, teachers must be aware of the outcomes they expect in order to ensure they surface. Rubrics provide this information and are found in every single Activate Learning Prime lesson. This rubric is taken from that same 4th grade energy transfer unit, and students are discussing their understanding of what energy is. They also categorize stored energy versus energy in action. In introductory discussions, rubrics help guide your discussion. If students seem to know the key concepts, and I'm going to show those more clearly to you here, it certainly may drive the discussion in instruction and discussion in a different direction. In reflective discussions, you're looking for that key criteria you want to hear from students. Rubrics contain that necessary information to place students on a learning continuum. This informs instruction and provides valuable information about a student's level of understanding. So those are some strategies that you can use. So let's kind of summarize here what was presented in some of the key points. Discussion is an important part of the learning process and is central to the work of scientists. It pushes thinking forward and allows students to share ideas. Discussions can be whole group, they can be small group, or they can be done in pairs. Whole group discussions are best accomplished when students can see each other's faces. Discussions are held to brainstorm or introduce a lesson where all are encouraged to share with no judgment. They may be sharing discussions where data is analyzed and students begin to formulate ideas, or they may be held to reflect and synthesize what has been learned. During this time, students make connections between what they did and what they are to learn. Teacher materials often contain lots of what is needed to instruct and support students as they learn to communicate, including speaking and listening effectively. But most importantly, we must make the time to provide instruction for our students on way to speak and listen to each other. I want to close with this quote from Lucy Calkins. In schools, talk is sometimes valued and sometimes avoided, but and this is surprising, talk is rarely taught. It is rare to hear teachers discuss their efforts to teach students to talk well. Yet talk, like reading and writing, is a major motor. I could even say the major motor of intellectual development. On behalf of Activate Learning, I'd like to thank you for spending some time with us. Have a good day.